Hey friends, I'm Key from Travel Made Personal, and as promised last week, today I'm going to tell you all about the Alabama road trip with the bestie. Buckle up guys, cause Murph sure did invite himself along on this one. So the bestie and I enjoy taking little weekender trips every other month or so to explore and release some stress. We decided this month we were going to take a weekend in Alabama again. Once that was decided, I set off to planning the trip. This would be our second trip to Alabama as we have some leftover business to finish from our first Alabama road trip. See, the bestie is from Alabama and has many ancestors buried there. On our first trip, we visited a few of their burial sites to repair some really old grave markers that were deteriorating. So this trip, we wanted to visit them again to fix a couple others that we found in need of repair on our first trip and to see how the previous repairs held up. Step 1 of every road trip is to plan our stops. So I pulled up my trusty road trip planner app, which is Road Trippers. This is always my first go-to tool to plan road trips. Now, Road Trippers has this new AI feature that will plan the trip for you if you're unsure of where you want to explore. But for me personally, I enjoy planning them myself as the bestie and I have very unique interests that may not be terribly interesting for most. So I select the plan it myself option and I enter where I'm starting from and where we're headed to. In this case, I'm going to put in Fort Cooper State Park as it is near to where I live. And then our main destination is Dothan, Alabama. So once I have that information in, I click go and begin planning our trip. Road Trippers takes just a minute to load the route and then it's ready for me to begin planning. Here you can see where my starting point is and where my main destination is. The first thing I'm going to do is go into the trip settings to give the trip a name, set the banner photo, and decide if I want to publicize the trip or keep it private. In this case, I'm going to keep it private because most of the stops will be very specific to the business we have there and another hobby of ours that others may not share. Next, I'll give it a description and then select which vehicle we're taking so that Road Trippers will give us a more accurate estimate of fuel costs. And then if someone is helping me plan the trip, I can add them as a collaborator. But in this case, I do the planning, so I'll just leave this part alone. Now I'm going to go into more settings where I can duplicate the trip, reroute the trip, reverse it, or make it round trip. Since I know we do plan to return from Dothan, I'm going to make this round trip. Now you can see that I'm leaving from Fort Cooper State Park, driving to Dothan, and then returning to Fort Cooper State Park. Next, I need to pick up my bestie. Since her house isn't really an attraction, I'll need to put in her address. But she really don't want you guys showing up at her house, so I'm going to use a place nearby, just like I did for mine. In this case, I'll use Walt Disney World. You guys are certainly free to show up there. Just know, it's not free, and you won't find my bestie there. Sorry, guys. So here's Walt Disney World. I'll add it to my trip as a placeholder for picking her up. It might seem silly since it isn't an actual attraction or a road trip stop, but adding her pickup location helps keep the fuel estimate more accurate. And since I'll be dropping her off at home after the trip, I'll add another nearby location as a placeholder for that. Now I'll close my search and fix the order of things. I'll be dropping her off after the trip to Dothan, so I just need to move one of these down toward the end of the trip. And now I can start customizing the trip by giving the stops custom names and entering the budget and any notes I want to add. Fort Cooper is the placeholder for my house, so I'll enter that here, and obviously my house is free for me. I plan to leave at 8 a.m., so I'll put that in the notes so that when I send the itinerary to my bestie, she'll have that noted and know when to expect me to arrive. I also put in the dates of the trip so that we can keep track of which destinations we're visiting on which days. There we go. It is set up as a round trip, road trip, with our houses on it and our main destination. So now it's time to start adding the places we intend to visit. So I'm going to zoom out so that road trippers will show me all the stops within a certain range of our route, and so I can hover over or click on different places to see what they're about. When I click on one, it'll open up a new window to show me the details. This allows me to see a description, reviews, photos, hours of operations, sometimes the price, if it's pet friendly, accessible, etc. So I'll just review the information available to determine if it's a stop we'd want to make. If it is, I would add it to my trip. In this case, it's not, so I'm just going to close it out. Now I'm a disabled veteran with a bad back, and the bestie has some neuropathy issues going on, so I try to make sure that we have an opportunity to get out and stretch every couple of hours to keep us feeling our bestest for the road trip. I happen to know that there is a ghost town near our route a little over 2 hours away from her house. So I'm just going to enter the name of that site and allow road trippers to find it for me. Once found, I'll add it to the trip, and I notice that there's also a cemetery there. So I'm going to add that as well, because that's definitely a part of the town's history and there may be some pioneers buried there. So why not check it out while we're there in the area? I'm just going to pull that up and add it to the trip as well. Now I have our first 2 stops added, so I'm going to look and see if there's more that we're interested in by following the route on the map and looking at what comes up. Keeping in mind that I want to drive a few hours before the next stop, I'm going to zoom back out a little bit and move a bit further north to look for stops. I've already been to Falling Creek Falls, and I'm not seeing much here that we're interested in, and I haven't done before. But the bestie and I are working on visiting all of Florida's state parks, and I do happen to know that there's a state park up in this area, so I'm just going to use the search feature to find it. I enter Lake Jackson, and it comes right up. So I click to open it, review the information, and add it to our trip. Now I need to fix the order of things again, because Road Trippers doesn't really understand the order of how we want to do things. So I'm just going to grab each stop and drop it where I want it to be on the trip. In this case, I want the Lake Jackson Mounds to be a stop we hit on the first day on the way to Dothan. So I just drag it up and drop it in place, and then I'll do the same for Noonan'sville Town and Cemetery. One thing to keep in mind is making sure that you're not doubling back a bunch of times to see sites. You want to see them in the order that you'll get to them on your route. That's the best way to save gas, right? Next, I set the budget and notes for each stop. This will help me keep track of how much the trip will cost us. I happen to know that Lake Jackson Mounds cost $2.50, so I add that to the budget on the stop, and my trip cost estimate is updated in real time at the top of the trip. Now I'm going to go into the Dothan area, as that is where we will be staying for the weekend, so I need to find a hotel. For the sake of time in this video, I'm just going to pick one. Normally, I would go off to Expedia.com to compare prices and book a hotel that accommodates our needs. Then I'd come back to Road Trippers to add that specific hotel to the trip. Obviously, we'll need to stay in the hotel the first night, so let me just pop this stop up to the last spot for the first day. And just like that, day 1 is planned. Now I can review the timing to make sure we're arriving at the hotel at a decent hour. Next, I can start working on day 2. So since we have business in specific cemeteries, I'm just going to enter the address for those cemeteries and give them a custom name so we know where we're going. And I'll add notes so that we know what we're doing there. We only plan to visit 2 cemeteries this trip, so this'll do for now. Now, I don't know about you guys, but the bestie and I enjoy a hobby called letterboxing. This is similar to geocaching in that people like us hide boxes in various places that have stamps in them, so you can stamp something as sort of a memento that you visited this place and found a box. Before each trip, I use a site called Atlas Quest to find hidden boxes in the areas we'll be visiting. Sometimes if there isn't one around, we'll plant one. When I find clues to boxes in the areas we'll be in, I add those addresses to the trip as well, and then enter the clue to find the box in the collaborator notes section, so it shows up on our itinerary while we're on the trip. Once I've chosen all of our stops and entered the custom information to each, I'll print out a copy of the itinerary so we have a paper copy if for some strange reason we're not able to access the itinerary in the app on our phones. This rarely happens, but I like to be prepared. Okay, so now that the first day of the trip is planned and you see how simple it is to plan our trips, I'm going to jump into how our trip actually went. In my intro video, I described how Murphy's Law loves to insert itself into my road trips. I'm constantly watching for Murph to rear his ugly head into my plans. In fact, it really seems like every time I plan a road trip, we get a hurricane. So the week before our trip, Hurricane Helene came through Florida's west coast and destroyed parts of Florida before causing catastrophic damage in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Being south of where Helene made landfall, my area wasn't impacted as bad. We mainly just had some smaller tree limbs down and minor flooding in places nearby. The Monday before our trip, my son let me know that his car wouldn't start. This was an issue because I did not want to leave my son home without transportation. So when he got home from work that evening, we went and bought him a new battery, and that fixed the problem. Trip is still on. Nice try, Murph. Tuesday, I checked the weather for the week and saw that a disturbance was developing on the west side of the Gulf of Mexico. I mentioned it to the bestie as something we need to watch. We both have adult kids at home and wouldn't want to leave them home alone during big storms. So we watched the weather reports each day, and even by Friday morning, the forecasts were calling for a rainmaker on Monday. We can drive in the rain, that's not a big deal. But nice try, Murph. Come Friday morning, the trip is on. Aside from hitting the road a little late for minor reasons, the day went pretty well. Traffic wasn't horrible, the truck did very well, we were in good moods, and the weather was decent. We drove the 2 hours to Noonan'sville and stopped there and walked around a bit. It was an interesting stop that we still have questions about. I'll be digging into that next week when I do the video on the Noonan'sville ghost town. We left Noonan'sville needing to pee. Guys, this is a common theme on our trip. We are moms that are getting up there in age, so we have to stop every hour or so. After that quick stop, we hit the highway again and realized that we had completely forgotten about a letterbox at Noonan'sville. Arg. Okay, well, it is what it is. Not a huge loss, it's just that we don't usually have much luck finding the letterboxes we're searching for, so it's a little frustrating when we completely forget to look. My bestie refers to her memory as dust on a handrail. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. So this trip, I started referring to her as Dusty. That is her new nickname for our trips. As we drove further north in Florida, we started seeing the damage from Hurricane Helene. As we were traveling through the Perry area where Helene made landfall, we saw some pretty bad damage to trees and structures, even just from the highway. It's gut-wrenching to see all of the destruction these storms cause. That was a pretty quiet part of the trip while we processed what we were seeing and reflected on how lucky we were to have been missed by this storm. Usually I'm very diligent when I plan trips, and I try to make sure we will have enough time to see all of the stops we planned. So I will plan time frames for each stop, but we've found that it adds stress to the trip if we get off schedule and end up not being able to visit each place. It also left no time to really go explore new places that we didn't know about when we were planning the trip. So we decided that this trip will be a chill trip and we will relax and just do the things as time permits while leaving ourselves plenty of time to explore new places. When we arrived at Lake Jackson Mounds, it was still pretty early in the day, before noon. So we were making good time by this point. We visited the first mound and then hiked into the woods to see an old mill that was hidden back in there somewhere. But we hadn't planned to hike that day, so we weren't wearing protective clothing or hiking shoes, and we were getting eaten alive by mosquitoes. So we ended up turning back before we found the mill. Murph caused me to break my ankle on a trip to Puerto Rico years ago on tree roots sticking out of the ground, and we were seeing similar hurdles on this hike. It was best to turn back. Not this time, Murph. When we walked over to see the biggest mound, the boardwalk to it was closed due to hurricane damage. So while we were able to see it, we couldn't walk over to it. That was a little frustrating. When we go places, we want to do and see it all. Maybe one day we'll visit this park again to see all the things. We're not letting it get us down on this trip, so we headed out again. Since we were making such good time, we pulled over a couple of times on day one to see some interesting things we passed on the way. I'll talk about those more in later videos, but I was glad we allowed ourselves this extra time to explore. We ended up arriving at our hotel by 2 p.m. This was real early for us. So we checked into the hotel and then we headed out to the cemetery scheduled for day 2 and took care of the business side of the trip. At the first cemetery, we found that the grave markers we had worked on last time had deteriorated more, and one of the new nameplates was completely gone. So we spent some time fixing up new grave markers for them that would also help preserve the old ones. We noted that we needed to replace the nameplate, and we planted a letterbox. Then we went to the second cemetery. We fixed what we needed to be fixed at this one, except for one real heavy obelisk stone. The top of this one was sinking into the ground next to its base. So we lifted that heavy thing to try and attach it back to its base, but the base was slanted so much that it started sliding right back off. So we had to lift it back to the ground and note that it still needed some fixing. It was getting dark by this point, so we headed back to the hotel for the night. Day 1 was great. We had some minor complications with the business side of the trip, and our lunch had upset my stomach a bit, but it was a good day regardless. As we took our showers and got ready to settle in for the night, we found that the ceiling of the bathroom in our hotel room was very moldy. This is bad, Murph. I am deathly allergic to mold. Thankfully, I brought Benadryl with me and knew what to do to handle the allergy. Sometimes this happens as a budget traveler. I do read the reviews for hotels we stay in, and when there's mention of mold or bugs, I avoid them. This one didn't have either of those mentioned. Luckily, there were no bugs, but mold is a big problem for me. We worked it out, and I ended up not getting sick, luckily. But geez, Murph. We obviously won't use that hotel again. Day 2 went just as well. We slept pretty well and ended up getting out and about by 5:30 a.m. We went searching for letterboxes for the first half of the day. We only found one, but it was in a cool spot and we had fun searching for the others while exploring the area. Then we went to Landmark Park, which was a place we were both excited to go explore. I'll be doing a video on that in the coming weeks as well. We spent a few hours there and enjoyed every minute of it. We got to pet who we affectionately refer to as Dominic the donkey, and he tried to eat my hand, but he was too cute not to forgive for it. After Landmark Park, we went to the other stops we had planned, as well as a few extras, and we still had everything on our itinerary done by early afternoon. So we went to a Chinese buffet and had a nice lunch, and then we went and explored a couple more cemeteries that had some of Dusty's ancestors in them. Murph didn't really mess with us too much on day 2, though. If he did, we were too chill to notice. Day 3 started off just as well. We left super early again and made our way up to Montgomery, Alabama. We stopped in downtown to see the Hank Williams statue and ended up exploring all of downtown while waiting for our next stop to open up because we were way early. We saw some cool stuff and had some cool conversations. We ended up skipping the last stop for Montgomery and heading up to Birmingham to visit Sloss Furnace's National Historic Landmark. Sloss was the main attraction for this trip. On a couple of stops this trip, people seemed to be bothered by my camera. I'm not sure why it is that a tourist can't walk around with a nice camera, but it was giving weird vibes and ended up causing us to skip one of the stops for the day. On one of the stops the previous day, a man demanded I take his picture in front of a historic house like I was a reporter or something. I did, and then he hugged me, which is not something strangers should ever try to do. When we got to Sloss, we immediately noticed there were tons of traffic and nowhere to park. This was shocking because I've never experienced crowds when visiting historic places like this. We ended up driving about 6 blocks before finding a parking spot and walking back to Sloss. By the time we got back, we realized that Sloss was actually closed for a death metal concert. Dang it, Murph! We came all this way! So we quietly walked back to the truck, hot, tired, and highly agitated. Before leaving the area, we decided to stop at a few of the parks in the area to explore so it didn't feel like a total loss. We visited an old mill and a couple state parks, and we got so excited at the parks. They were great stops. Completely made up for missing Sloss, though we still want to visit Sloss. As we were traveling during this part of the day, we started getting messages from family about a storm. We were totally confused because we knew we were facing a rainmaker the next day, but we started seeing posts on Facebook about a Category 5 hurricane. So we looked it up and found that sure enough, there was a hurricane developing in the Gulf of Mexico completely separate from the rainmaker, and that forecasters expected it to become a Category 5 hurricane before making landfall in Florida. Oh boy. Okay. Once we determined that it wasn't going to hit until Wednesday, 2 days after we returned from the trip, we decided to go ahead and enjoy the rest of the trip. We made our way back down to Dothan, and everything went fine after that, other than missing the last stop because it was too dark to see it. We drove to it, but it was pitch black, so we saw nothing. We went back to the hotel and crashed pretty hard that night. Monday morning, we got up early again and packed up pretty much immediately. We did have a couple of stops planned for the trip home, but it was mostly a scramble to get home and get prepared for a major hurricane. We stopped at an old bridge and ghost town first. We had planned to hike back into the woods to find the ruins of an old mansion there, but the damage from Hurricane Helene made it unsafe for us to do so because of all of the downed trees. So we decided to come back at some point after the area had been cleaned up. When we got back to our truck, there was a gopher tortoise that a man had stopped from crossing a busy road. He had named the tortoise Kyle. So we visited Kyle for a minute while the guy told us we either needed to jumpstart the old school bus he was living in or give him a ride somewhere. I said we weren't giving him a ride. He's not getting in my truck and I don't have jumper cables, so we'd have to go to a store first. He said, well, you could just jump me, ha ha ha. Yeah, we didn't find that funny, dude. Learn some respect. He kept talking about us coming into the bus to see his junk and stuff. We made our way to the truck and left. If you want help from people, maybe learn to read the room and know your audience. We got serial killer vibes, so we bolted. Weirdo. Our last stop was a state park. Unfortunately, the trails at this park were all closed due to the damage from Hurricane Helene. So it was a short stop and we didn't really see anything. But we were ready to get home anyway. By this time, we were seeing that the northbound side of the highway was completely stacked with people trying to evacuate Florida for this Category 5 hurricane that was on the way, Hurricane Milton. By the time we got to Dusty's house, my GPS was no longer working because of all the emergency alerts we were getting on our phones about the hurricane. As I left her house, Spotify stopped working too, and my dash was completely useless. I was luckily able to fill my tank up with gas before the gas station ran out, but it took a little while to get through the line. I took the back roads home to avoid the interstates because the evacuation was at a standstill, and I didn't want to be caught in that. The drive home was real eerie as I went through some small towns that were completely dark with no other cars on the road. But I finally made it home around 9 p.m. on Monday and started preparing for work the next day and the upcoming hurricane. Hurricane Milton made landfall Wednesday evening as a Category 3 storm after weakening from the Category 5. My small town lost power pretty much everywhere, and there were trees down all over the place. My parents live a few minutes down the road from me and experienced a tornado which caused a tree to fall on their house. They're okay. Dusty's okay. We're all okay. But we're a little angry with Murph right now for ruining the chill that we were able to obtain on this trip. We came back to chaos, which undid the reset that we got from the trip. So, it's time to start planning another trip. In the meantime, stay tuned for my videos in the coming weeks where I will share with you all of the stops we made this trip and what we took away from them, and maybe start planning a trip for yourself while you wait, yeah? Be sure to like and subscribe so you'll get notified as those videos get released. But for now, get out there and explore the world your way.